It's 1990, Germany has just been reunified, The Simpsons is shown for the very first time on TV, and Land Rover came out with this, the CSK, the most influential Range Rover since the original. I am so torn for this review because on the one hand, this is one of the most important and influential cars of the last 30 years, and quite frankly, a stroke of genius. On the other, it set a trend for cars that I deeply dislike. In this video, I'm going to tell you what makes it so special compared to any normal Range Rover. We're going to take it for a drive, and I'm also going to tell you why part of me wishes it never existed. To the average person, this will just look like an early Range Rover, but rarely has a badge been so very important. The CSK was built to commemorate 20 years of production of Range Rover, but more importantly, it was also there to introduce new, sportier handling. Only 200 of these were ever built. Now this last bit is really important because it's the first time that sport was truly put into sports utility vehicle. Let me tell you a little bit more about the CSK. First of all, there were some touches outside. It had these special wheels with the sort of black inner circles. They all came in a wonderfully deep black, beluga black it was called. They had chrome little inserts on the bumpers at the front, and the air dam and fog lights were also specific to this model. The other very important difference, of course, is that it had a two-door body shell. There's also differences to the interior, importantly to the chassis and to the engine. But let's take it out, I'll tell you how it drives and also why it was so disruptive. Well, it was named after Charles Spencer King, who did the original design for the Range Rover. Interestingly, he was also the designer for the Rover P6, another great car. Now, for this special edition, let's quickly talk about the interior. They didn't just want this to be sort of a flag bearer in the sports tradition, but also luxury. So, American walnut was featured throughout. The door cards were specific and unique to this, with carpeted bottom end and then perforated soft leather on top. Same leather for these lovely seats, which also I think weren't in any other Range Rover of that time, and they are incredibly comfortable. They're more like chairs than seats. Most of them came as manuals. The auto was a $3,000 option. I'll talk about pricing later, which is also quite important, but having an auto CSK is actually quite rare. Being the auto, I had a look. There seems to be, at least in official figures, 9.9 seconds, there is no difference. This is a 4-speeder. Compared to nowadays, obviously it's not fast. The SUVs that you have now are able to cover ground incredibly quickly despite their size. But if you compare it to what was around in the 90s, this was a bit of a rocket ship. So let's talk about the engine first. It has the venerable Rover V8, which was originally Buick sourced. But on this car, it put up, at the time, the highest ever output of 185 horsepower. That was thanks to a remapped ECU. And in order to handle the extra power and to make it more rewarding to drive, they made some quite significant changes to the chassis. The springing and shocks all round were 25% stiffer, but what really made the biggest difference was that for the very first time, they included anti-roll bars front and back. Previous to this, Land Rover had resisted that because they thought that it would impede articulation when it was being driven off-road. They actually designed a system with certain types of bushings that meant that in the end, having those anti-roll bars didn't impede its off-road ability at all and made it much better on road. Already it feels like there's a little bit less float on this. The steering though is still quite recognisably Range Rover, so it just has that vagueness on the straight ahead, and it feels pretty dead. You don't get that much communication coming through. Then again, it was never going to be an outright sports car. It's more about what it represented that they made these changes in the first place, and the far-reaching consequences that they were going to have. Brake pedal is quite firm, which I like. Now coming down here, the normal Range Rover would have literally been on its ear. There's still a fair amount of lean, but it just handles it with much more panache than the standard car would do. If you want the gearbox to kick down, you have to put literally your foot right down to the floor, otherwise it just doesn't respond. And even then, I don't know if you could tell, there's about a second gap before it does respond. Let's just do another pull, because that Rover V8 sounds so distinctive. Let's just see if we can get it turned round before this other car comes, and yes, we can. So foot to the floor again. Even when you're going from almost a standing start, the gearbox doesn't like to change down when it should. So brakes feel good actually, and you get a little bit of feel through the pedal as well, which is nice. And then the steering is so slow. I think that's part of what makes it fun though. It's like you're piloting something rather than driving it. Always aware of that mass, which is, it's tall, isn't it, this car? But it acquitted itself pretty well there actually. It was quite neutral going through that left-hander. Always tends to throw cars, the back end's out that one. It's quite a lethal corner in the wrong conditions, but quite a secure handling thing. Now most of you know that I'm not a fan of SUVs, but I have to say I do have a soft spot for Range Rovers of this era, the first generation. I just think they look so right. Now whoever came up with the raised edges on the corners was just a genius. It makes the car so easy to place on the road. Now don't forget, in those days it would have been considered a really big car. Nowadays it's definitely not small, but compared to everything else that's grown, it's not quite the behemoth that it once was. Now it's said that the two-door body shell was put on it because they wanted to make it more distinctive, but I suspect, and I have heard, that in actual fact they had two-door body shells that they had to get rid of, and that to me makes a little bit more sense. Although I love it so much and I think that it's such a distinctive thing, it's a car that I almost wish hadn't existed. Why is that? Well, the original Range Rover was trend-setting on its own because it introduced everyday comfort and usability to off-road vehicles, and that in itself was really impactful. But up until that point, there was still quite a clear distinction. This was the very first car, as far as I'm aware. There might be some American SUVs before this that did the same thing, but I don't know of them if there are. This was the very first one that introduced the concept of really putting sport in sports, in SUV, in sports utility vehicle. They tried to make it handle and drive more like a sports car. I think they were pretty successful in comparison to the original Range Rover, to the standard car. Overall, it still doesn't drive like one today, but they ushered in that concept that further corrupted the car landscape today. So now we are awash with these things. I don't even think crossovers would exist if it wasn't for this car. It was one of these, it is a crossover in a way. It just molded two categories together and it opened the way for a change from what I like, the traditional sort of idea of cars, where you had a super mini, you had a hatchback, you had a saloon, you had these, you had off-road vehicles, you had sports cars. And it just mashed it all together, and people like it. People like it so much that now SUVs, you know, bigger cars, crossovers, you know, the Range Rover Sport, this was the first, it's not called a Sport, but this was the first Range Rover Sport. An incredibly impactful car, but one that ushered in an era of driving that I deeply lament. Love this car, hate what it represents, unfortunately. The other interesting thing about the CSK is values. The only one I saw for sale was £80,000. There was also a project car sold on Collecting Classics recently. I think that went for 30 or 35,000. So a lot of value in these right now. But even more interesting is how much they cost when they were new. It was the most expensive Range Rover at the time. The manual version would have been 28,500. What's even more interesting though is how that compares to other cars that were on sale at the time. Let's just get some sports cars. So a Honda NSX was £58,000, so almost double the cost of this. And a Ferrari 348, £68,000. It's interesting when you look today because a Range Rover Sport is, I think the starting list price is about £74,000, which if you compare it to the equivalent sports cars of today, the little Ferraris and so on, the ratio has kept similar. But the most expensive Range Rovers aren't the sports, they are the normal long wheelbase cars, the ultra luxury ones. For those, I think, last time I looked, they were much closer in price to the little sports cars like the Ferraris, 150, 200,000 pounds if you go mad on the options. So a little bit crazy what happened with the pricing. Thank you so much to Dave who brought it down today. It's got a lovely story, this, because it belonged to his father-in-law and he had it from only 18 months old. And it's a proper car that is used. It looks pretty straight to me, but you know, there's signs of patina and wear. It does get used 80,000 miles. If you don't yet follow me on Facebook, please do. I'll put a pinned comment with this video. I'm just trying to publicize that page a little bit more, and I put some extra content on there every day. Thank you so much, and see you for the next video.